Welcome to another smartphone camera comparison. Today we have the iPhone 15 Pro Max and the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6. But which one of these will perform the best? Let's find out.
Hey, I'm Olive, your host here at Versus.com, and let the comparison begin.
As always, we'll start off with standard wide photos as we feel that's the mode people use most frequently.
Right off the bat, you can clearly see that the iPhone has resulted in a far more detailed photo, whereas Sony has blown out the highlights, which in return has lost a lot of details specifically noticeable in Max's t-shirt and in the building and sky. In the second example, the iPhone has done a better job with the color accuracy, especially when it comes to my skin tone. Sony has a tendency to produce magenta undertones, which are specifically noticeable in skin tones, and although it's not terrible, it doesn't always look the best. In this final example, both devices have given us pretty good results, and there really aren't any major differences apart from slightly higher exposure on the Sony, which is a standard occurrence. And you will see what I mean when we look at some upcoming examples.
Now let's move on to ultra-wide photos, which are really great for capturing more of the scenery in your photos.
In this first ultra-wide example, apart from Sony once again having slightly higher exposure and paler skin tones, both devices have resulted in equally good photos that are 100% usable. Next, we have a slightly different situation. The iPhone's image has a bit of a green undertone, which isn't ideal. However, although Sony has a nice warm hue, the magenta undertones could be a bit too strong for some. In the end though, it does come down to personal preference, as neither photo is ideal, but both are totally usable and could be adjusted with a few tweaks in post. In this last example, it's instantly clear that the iPhone has done a better job, as once again, Sony has lost a lot of details due to its recurring overexposure issues. You can see this specifically on Max's shoe and on his shirt.
It's time to test out some portrait photos and see which one of these gives off the best bokeh and edge detection.
Sony continues to struggle with overexposure, resulting in a rather poor photo. In contrast, the iPhone handles exposure perfectly, producing an image with accurate colors and decent contrast. My points remain the same in the next example. Both devices perform well in edge detection, but the iPhone has a slightly more natural look, successfully capturing even the tiniest hairs on my head. In the final example, the overexposure in Sony's image is extreme. It completely disregards the background, blowing out the highlights and losing a significant amount of detail, so choosing the better image is really not difficult in this case. By the way, if you want more in-depth information about the devices aside from their camera capabilities, then you can check out our website Versus.com for lots more useful information.
Now let's move on to videos and see which one of these gives us the best results. Whilst I'm at it, I'm also going to be checking out some ultra-wide videos.
We recorded with both devices in 4K 30 FPS, and firstly, let's examine a couple of standard wide examples. In the first one, Sony performs quite well. The exposure is well maintained, and the color accuracy is spot on. The iPhone, however, is actually quite disappointing. The shadows are too lifted, the contrast is too low, resulting in a dull looking video. Additionally, the harsh green tint that the iPhone sometimes produces is very unappealing. In the second example, the room behind Max is in fact pink, not yellow. So it's very strange why the iPhone's white balance is completely off, whereas Sony has completely accurate coloring. However, the closer Max gets to the camera, the more underexposed Sony becomes, which isn't ideal. So in this regard, neither device is perfect, but they've both got something to offer in different ways. Moving on to ultra-wide videos. It's evident that the iPhone has a wider crop, which is desirable in this mode. However, the video is slightly overexposed, losing some details, such as those on my shoes, for example, and my skin tone is completely washed out. Sony, on the other hand, has done a good job maintaining a warm feel with accurate colors and appropriate shadows. Again, in this next example, it's clear that Sony's ultra-wide lens isn't as wide as the iPhone's. However, the iPhone continues to have extreme white balance issues, as like I mentioned, this room is in fact pink, not yellow. When it comes to every other factor though, Sony has actually produced a really good video.
Stabilization is such a crucial part of your smartphone. You want to have that smooth, buttery footage when you're running about and shooting videos. So let's go for a run and test these out.
shots were taken with the ultrawide camera, and in this first test, it's evident that Sony's stabilization is slightly less effective than the iPhone's. While the differences aren't major, the iPhone does produce smoother footage. And in the second test with the active stabilization mode enabled, both devices performed pretty well and delivered the expected results.
Time for some selfies. I'm about to test out the front camera and see how good it is on both of these. I'm also going to test out the video on front camera and audio.
In this first example, both devices performed equally well, producing nice results, so I don't have many remarks. It's gotta be a tie here. The same can be said for the second example. The iPhone has a warmer and sharper image, while Sony has paler skin tones and a smoother look. Ultimately, this does come down to personal preference. In this last low-light example, it's clear that Sony has done a better job exposing me well while maintaining a low-light ambience. Unfortunately, the iPhone's flash failed to detect the low light conditions, resulting in a dim and blurry image. Moving on to front camera video, it's immediately clear that Sony is super blurry when I'm standing further away from the camera. The iPhone doesn't look too great either, producing very green and dull looking skin tones, but it does have significantly more detail than Sony.
So starting with the built-in microphone and audio coming from the iPhone 15 Pro Max. What do we think? How do I sound on here? It's a little bit busy, so I'm really curious to see how it's gonna handle that. Then here we have the Sony. What do we think? It looks a little bit overexposed compared to the iPhone, but I'm not sure. I need to see it on a bigger screen. And how is the audio sounding? What do you guys think?
When it comes to audio, it's instantly clear which one is better. The iPhone has good noise cancellation abilities, which is particularly useful in a slightly noisier atmosphere. Unfortunately, Sony doesn't sound great, and its noise cancellation abilities seem pretty much non-existent, which can be quite irritating to the ear.
Slow motion can be a really cool feature to have in your videos, so let's see which one of these performs best when put into slow-mo.
What's nice about Sony is that it can shoot at 120 frames per second in 4K, which unfortunately the iPhone cannot. However, the iPhone is able to shoot up to 240 frames per second, but only in 1080p. However, this can be a good option to have and useful for certain individuals. In this case, they each get a point for their capabilities.
Which one of these has the best zoom capabilities? Well, we're about to find out.
At 3x zoom, the iPhone definitely has resulted in a more detailed image, as Sony has lost lots of details due to its overexposure in the sky. At 5x zoom, both devices have done well, with Sony still having a little more exposure in the sky, but it has not ruined the overall image. At 10x zoom, Sony has lost some detail in the sky, yet again, as its highlights are too high with the contrast too low. However, the iPhone has produced quite a bit of noise all over, which isn't a good look, therefore they need to tie here. Same can be said for 30x zoom, as both images provide enough detail, but the iPhone has far too much noise and Sony's contrast is a tad too low with the exposure too high.
Macro shots are always so fascinating. Let's see which one of these performs the best. Wow.
Sony includes a dedicated macro feature that is particularly useful for close-up shots. Additionally, it has a focus peaking slider, which simplifies focusing by avoiding reliance on software detection. In contrast, the iPhone often struggles to recognize the intent to take a macro shot and can automatically switch lenses, which can be somewhat frustrating.
Finally, let's take a look at some low-light photos and see how each of these devices handles that.
Starting with a standard wide photo, this one comes down to personal preference, as both images look decent in their own ways. Sony has harsher shadows and a more magenta warm feel, but it still manages to exhibit a nice low light ambience. On the other hand, the iPhone has higher exposure and a warmer yellow feel that some may prefer. In the next ultra-wide example, it's evident that the iPhone has struggled with white balance, rendering me completely yellow, while Sony has managed the white balance pretty well and also achieved sufficient exposure. In portrait mode, the iPhone has a slight hiccup with edge detection around my head, but overall it has produced a better image. Sony's photo is generally overexposed and has a lot of noise. Moving on to videos, in wide standard mode, the iPhone has better dynamic range, handling light sources better, especially noticeable on the screen to the left. However, Sony has nicer coloring, with Max's skin tone appearing more true to life, while the iPhone has turned him into a Simpson character. In ultrawide video, neither device produced very good results. Both videos have overexposed areas and a lot of noise. In terms of skin tone, Sony did better, but in terms of framing, the iPhone performed better. But to be honest, none of the videos are that great. Alright, let's do a quick summary and see who the winners are when it comes to the camera. For standard photos, the iPhone comes in first place. Next, we have ultrawide photos, where the iPhone once again takes first place. In portrait mode, can you guess? Yep, it's the iPhone in first place once again. However, in videos using the back cameras, Sony actually takes the win, but when it comes to stabilization, the iPhone beats Sony. For front camera photos and videos, it is actually a draw between the two, but when it comes to audio, it is a win for the iPhone. The iPhone also wins the zoom category. Slow motion is a tie, and for macro photos, it goes to Sony for its dedicated macro feature. Finally, for low light photos and videos, it is another tie, which means that our overall winner is indeed the iPhone. Well done, iPhone. So that pretty much sums up these two different phones when battled against each other. We really hope that you found this review useful and that you also enjoyed it, and we would love to hear your thoughts. Which one would you choose? Make sure to let us know in the comments down below. Choosing which device to go for really depends on what your preferences are. Do you need ultra slow-mo? In that case, the iPhone would be super useful, or perhaps you'd like to capture some awesome macro shots. Well, then Sony's got your back. You really can't go wrong with either choice, as both devices are top-notch in their own ways. As always, give this video a big like if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to be a part of our Versus.com community if you aren't already. With that being said, we will see you in the next video, and until then, take care.